You don't bring a $10 million check into a place like this, unless you're trying to pretend you belong. The paper tore with a sharp, deliberate rip that echoed louder than it should have in a room built for quiet deals and polished smiles. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. And just like that, something invisible shifted in the air. Ethan Cole didn't move. He stood there in his worn denim jacket, boots still dusted from a long day's work, watching the two halves of the check drift slowly toward the marble floor like they meant nothing. Around him, a few people chuckled under their breath, the kind of laughter that wasn't loud but carried weight, the kind that decided who mattered and who didn't. "You really thought this would work?" the woman behind the desk said, her voice smooth but edged with disbelief. "We don't process jokes here." Another voice joined in, lighter, sharper. "Or fantasies." Ethan's gaze lowered for a moment, not in shame, not in defeat, but as if he were measuring something far deeper than their words. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow across glass walls and polished steel, a place where appearances were currency and silence often meant power. But his silence was different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't weak. It was steady. "I'm not here to joke," he said quietly, his voice calm enough that it didn't need to rise to be heard. That should have ended it. But it didn't. The woman shook her head, folding her arms with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Sir, people with real money don't walk and dress like that. And they definitely don't hand over checks like it's a grocery receipt." A few more laughs. Someone in the back lifted a phone, subtle, curious, ready to capture a moment that felt entertaining enough to remember. Ethan didn't look at them. He didn't look at the cameras or the smirks or the judgment hanging thick in the air. He looked at the torn pieces of paper resting on the floor, and for a second, the room felt like it was holding its breath without knowing why. Then the glass doors behind them opened. It wasn't loud, just the soft click of precision and purpose. Heels against marble. One step, then another. The kind of sound that didn't demand attention, but took it anyway. Conversations didn't stop all at once, but they thinned, like a wave pulling back before something no one could quite see yet. The woman at the desk straightened instinctively, her posture shifting before her mind caught up. Someone near the hallway lowered their voice mid-sentence. And still, Ethan didn't turn around. He already knew that sound. Not the heels, not the door, but the silence that followed them. The kind of silence that didn't come from discomfort, but from recognition. The sound of those footsteps settled into the room like a quiet command, not loud enough to interrupt, but powerful enough that people adjusted themselves without realizing it, shoulders straightening, voices lowering, eyes shifting toward the entrance as if pulled by something they could not quite name, and the woman behind the desk, who moments ago had been so certain, so composed, now found her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the counter as she turned, her expression, rehearsing confidence, but landing somewhere closer to uncertainty, because standing there, framed by glass and light, was Victoria Hale, and she did not need to introduce herself. She never did. Her presence carried its own language, one built on years of decisions that moved numbers most people could not even imagine. And yet today, there was something different in the way she paused just inside the doorway, not scanning the room the way she usually did, not acknowledging the staff waiting for her direction, but instead letting her gaze fall, slowly, deliberately, to the floor where the torn pieces of the check rested like a question no one had asked out loud. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because something deeper than instruction had taken hold, the kind of silence that arrives when people sense they are standing at the edge of understanding something too late. "Ma'am," the receptionist began, her voice softer now, carefully controlled. "We had a situation, a man came in claiming, 'I see what happened,'" Victoria said, not raising her voice, not rushing her words, but each syllable landing with a clarity that cut through the room more effectively than any command. She took a step forward, her heels marking the distance with quiet precision, and stopped just short of the counter, her eyes lifting from the paper to the man who still had not turned around. And that was when something shifted again, smaller this time, but sharper, because recognition is never loud. It is a quiet certainty that settles into place. "Did you tear this?" she asked. And the question was not aimed at the room. It was aimed at the woman behind the desk, who now hesitated, just long enough for the answer to lose its confidence. "Yes, I did." I believed it was inappropriate, she replied, her words measured, searching for ground that no longer felt stable. Victoria nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the explanation without accepting it. Then her gaze returned to Ethan, taking in the details others had dismissed, the worn edges of his jacket, the steady posture, the stillness that did not come from uncertainty but from control, and for a brief second, the noise of the building seemed to fade entirely, replaced by something far more precise, something that only a few people in the room would later realize they had witnessed. And you, the receptionist added, trying to reclaim something of the moment, should not be here making claims you cannot support. 3 quick statements followed, each sharper than the last, each trying to rebuild authority that had already begun to slip. But then came the pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to change everything. Victoria's expression did not harden, it did not soften, it simply settled, and when she finally spoke again, it was not louder, not harsher, but undeniably different. That check, she said, glancing once more at the torn paper, was not a claim. 2 seconds of silence, a breath held somewhere in the back of the room, and then, the shift, subtle, irreversible, was a courtesy. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it did not fit the version of reality everyone in that room had already agreed on. A courtesy, not a donation, not a mistake, not a desperate attempt to belong. And the receptionist felt it first, that quiet fracture in her certainty, the kind that does not shatter all at once but spreads slowly beneath the surface. A courtesy, she repeated, her voice tightening just slightly, trying to reshape the meaning into something manageable, something safe. But Victoria did not look at her again. Her attention had already moved, fully, deliberately, to Ethan, who finally shifted, not in a rush, not in defense, but with the same calm he had carried since the moment the paper was torn. He turned just enough to meet her gaze. And there it was, recognition, not dramatic, not emotional, just precise, like 2 people acknowledging a truth that had always existed whether others saw it or not. You should not have come in person, Victoria said, her tone even, but layered with something the room could not quite interpret. Not reprimand, not concern, something closer to respect, quiet and unspoken. And that was when the air changed again, sharper now, more defined, because respect is something people feel before they understand it. The receptionist blinked, her posture faltering for a fraction of a second before she straightened again, clinging to the structure she believed she still controlled. Ma'am, with all due respect, we cannot just accept random checks without verification. There are protocols. 3 quick sentences followed, each one an attempt to rebuild authority, to remind the room of rules, of order, of the system that had always worked before this moment. And for a second, it almost held. Almost. Until Victoria stepped closer, her heels marking the floor with quiet certainty, and bent slightly, just enough to pick up 1/2 of the torn check, her fingers holding it with a care that seemed out of place for something dismissed as worthless minutes ago. She glanced at the numbers, then at the signature, and something unreadable passed across her expression. Not surprise, not doubt, but confirmation, slow and absolute. She straightened, turning the paper slightly so the receptionist could see it. Do you know what this is? She asked, and the question was simple, almost gentle, but it carried weight now, the kind that pressed against the edges of the room. The receptionist hesitated, her confidence thinning. It is a check, she answered, the words sounding smaller than she intended. Victoria nodded once, then once more, as if acknowledging the surface truth while preparing to reveal something deeper. No, she said quietly. It is a decision. 2 seconds passed. A breath caught somewhere behind the glass walls, a phone lowered slowly, unnoticed, and you just tore it in half. The room did not react all at once. It never does. Instead, it tightened, subtle shifts in posture, in breathing, in the way people looked at Ethan now, not fully understanding, but no longer certain of what they had dismissed, and still, he said nothing, his hands resting at his sides, his expression unchanged, as if the moment did not belong to him to explain, only to endure. Victoria turned back to him, her voice softer now, but somehow carrying further. I apologize, she said, and the word did not echo. It settled, heavy and undeniable. This should not have happened. And that was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. When the room realized it was no longer watching a misunderstanding unfold, it was witnessing a correction, one that had already begun before anyone knew they were wrong. The apology did not echo the way people expected apologies to echo. It did not come with urgency or excuses or a rush to fix what had already been done. It arrived quietly, like a truth that did not need to defend itself, and that made it heavier, not lighter. The receptionist felt it settle somewhere behind her ribs, a pressure she could not quite name, and for the first time since the moment she tore the check, she looked at Ethan differently, not fully understanding, but no longer certain. She had been right. "Ma'am, I was only following protocol," she said, her voice careful now, each word placed with intention, as if precision alone could restore what had already shifted. "We are trained to identify irregular transactions, and this appeared to be one." 3 statements, structured, controlled, the way she had been taught, but something in the room had already moved beyond structure. Victoria did not interrupt her. She let the explanation finish, let it stand on its own weight, and then she nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the logic without agreeing to its conclusion. "Protocol is important," she said, her tone calm, measured, "but it is not a substitute for judgment." 2 seconds passed, the kind that stretched just enough to make people aware of themselves, of where they were standing, of what they had said moments ago when it still felt safe. She placed the torn half of the check gently on the counter, aligning it with the other piece, as if restoring something symbolic rather than practical. And then she turned fully toward Ethan, her posture shifting just slightly, not lower, not submissive, but aligned, respectful in a way that could not be faked. "Sir," she said, and the word did not rise above a normal speaking tone, but it carried through the room with a clarity that silenced even the smallest movement. A pen stopped mid-click, a breath paused halfway, a phone lowered without thought, because respect, when it is real, does not need volume. It creates its own space, and in that space, everything else becomes smaller. The receptionist's eyes widened just slightly, the title landing before its meaning fully formed, her mind racing to reconcile the man she had dismissed with the way he was now being addressed. "Sir," she repeated under her breath, not as a question, but as a realization arriving too late. Ethan inclined his head just a fraction, acknowledging the word without absorbing it, without letting it change the stillness he carried. "You did not have to come yourself," Victoria continued, her voice steady. "We could have handled this privately." 3 sentences followed, softer, more deliberate, each one revealing a layer the room had not been invited to see, and with each word, the distance between assumption and truth grew wider, more uncomfortable. The receptionist took a step back without meaning to, her confidence no longer something she could hold in place. "I was not aware," she said quickly, almost reflexively. "No one informed me." 2 statements, defensive, searching for footing, but there was none left to stand on. Victoria turned her head slightly, just enough to meet her gaze again. "That is exactly the point," she replied, not unkind, not harsh, just precise. And then the silence returned, not empty, not awkward, but full. The kind of silence that follows understanding, the kind that leaves no room for laughter, no space for dismissal, only reflection. And in that silence, Ethan reached down, picked up the 2 torn pieces of the check, and held them together for a brief moment, not to fix them, not to prove anything, just to look at them as they were. And then he lowered his hands again, his voice calm, almost gentle. "It was never about the money," he said, and the room, already quiet, somehow became quieter still. The words did not rise, they settled, and that was what made them impossible to ignore. It was never about the money, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to pause around that truth as if it had been waiting to hear it, as if something deeper had just been named without needing explanation. The receptionist swallowed, her throat tightening slightly, because suddenly the numbers on that check no longer felt like the center of the moment. They felt like a distraction. "Then why come here?" she asked, her voice quieter now, no longer sharp, no longer certain, just searching, trying to understand what she had misread so completely. Ethan did not answer right away, He glanced down at the torn paper in his hands, then back up, his expression unchanged, steady, grounded, the kind of calm that does not come from having something to prove, but from knowing there is nothing left to defend. Because sometimes, he said slowly, how something is received matters more than what is given. 3 sentences followed, measured, deliberate, each one landing with quiet weight. Anyone can write a number, he continued, but not everyone knows what to do when it shows up in front of them. The room did not react outwardly, but something inside it shifted again, smaller this time, more personal. People stopped looking at the check and started looking at themselves, at what they had thought just minutes ago, at how quickly they had decided who he was without asking a single question. Victoria remained still, her attention fixed on Ethan, not interrupting, not guiding, just allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, because she understood something the others were only beginning to feel. This was not about correcting a mistake, it was about revealing one. The receptionist exhaled slowly, her posture softening in a way she could not control. I made a judgment, she admitted, the words quiet, almost reluctant, but real, based on appearance. 2 seconds passed, the kind that stretches long enough to carry meaning, and I was wrong. The admission did not repair anything. It did not undo what had happened, but it changed something important. It shifted the room from defense to reflection, and that shift was louder than any argument could have been. Ethan nodded once, not in approval, not in satisfaction, just acknowledgement, as if he had been waiting not for an apology, but for understanding. It happens, he said simply, and there was no bitterness in his voice, no edge, just clarity, the kind that leaves no space for resentment, only for recognition. Victoria took a small step closer, her presence no longer commanding in the way it had been when she entered, but aligned, grounded, as if she had stepped into the same quiet space Ethan had been standing in all along. We will make this right, she said, her tone steady, but there was something beneath it now, not authority, but respect, genuine and unforced. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the room had reached a point where words were no longer needed to explain what had already been understood. And in that silence, Ethan folded the torn pieces of the check together, not to restore them, not to fix what had been broken, but simply to hold them as they were. Then he placed them gently on the counter, not as an offering, not as a transaction, but as a reminder. And when he looked up, again his voice was soft, almost quiet enough to miss. Respect, he said, is not something you can process later. One breath, one still moment. It either shows up when it matters, another pause, deeper now, or it does not show up at all. The words did not fade when he finished speaking. They stayed, suspended in the air like something no one could step around. Respect either shows up when it matters or it does not show up at all. And for a long second, no one tried to respond, not because they did not have anything to say, but because anything they said would have felt smaller than what had already been understood. The receptionist lowered her eyes briefly, not in shame alone, but in recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and settles deeper than embarrassment ever could. I see that now, she said, her voice softer than before, stripped of the certainty it once carried. 3 words, simple, but real, and that was the difference. The room felt it, not as a correction, but as a shift. Victoria exhaled slowly, her posture easing just slightly, not losing authority, but no longer needing to assert it, because authority, when it is real, does not need to press itself forward. It waits, it observes, it understands when to speak and when to remain still. She glanced at the check again, then back at Ethan. There is still an opportunity here, she said, her tone measured, careful. If you are willing, we can correct what was mishandled. 2 sentences followed, calm, deliberate. We can process this properly, ensure it reaches where it was intended. The offer was not transactional, it was respectful, an acknowledgement that something valuable had been interrupted, not just in dollars, but in intention. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, steady as ever, and for a moment, it seemed like he might simply walk away, not out of anger, not out of pride, but because the moment had already said what it needed to say. The room waited, not for his decision, but for what it would reveal about everything that had just unfolded. No, he said finally, his voice calm, almost gentle. And the word did not land harshly. It settled, like everything else he had said, quiet but absolute. The receptionist looked up again, surprised, uncertain. "No," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head slightly, not dismissive, not cold, just clear. "What needed to be understood already is." 3 sentences followed, measured, grounded. "This was never about completing a transaction," he continued. "It was about seeing whether it would be recognized." The room did not move, did not breathe the same way it had moments ago, because now the weight of the moment had shifted fully from the check to the people standing around it. Victoria studied him for a second longer, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in doubt, but in thought, and then she nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if accepting something deeper than his words, something she had known before he even arrived. "Then at least allow us to thank you," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of any formality that had once defined it. "Not for the amount," she added, "but for the reminder." 2 seconds passed, quiet, steady, the kind that carried meaning without needing explanation. Ethan glanced around the room, not searching, not judging, just observing, and what he saw was not the same room that had laughed minutes ago. The expressions had changed, the posture had changed, the air itself felt different, heavier, more aware, and that was enough. He reached for the check once more, not to reclaim it, but to fold it, carefully, deliberately, placing the torn halves together as if acknowledging what had been done without trying to undo it. Then he slipped it into his jacket pocket, not as something lost, but as something finished, and when he looked up again, his voice was quiet, steady, unmistakably clear. "Sometimes," he said, "what people do when they think no one important is watching, one breath, one still moment, tells you everything you need to know." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. No one moved right away, not because they were waiting for permission, but because something inside them had already been paused, the kind of stillness that does not come from confusion, but from realization. And as Ethan's words settled into the space, people began to shift, slowly, almost carefully, as if they were suddenly aware of themselves in a way they had not been before. The receptionist drew in a quiet breath, her hands resting against the counter, not as a barrier anymore, but as something to steady herself. "I understand," she said, and this time the words did not sound rehearsed. They did not sound like protocol. They sounded like someone who had just seen something clearly for the first time. 3 short phrases followed, softer, grounded. "I saw the jacket, the boots, the way you walked in," she admitted, "and I decided the rest before you even spoke." The room listened, not because they were required to, but because they recognized themselves in what she was saying, the quick judgments, the silent conclusions, the way people assign value before understanding. Victoria remained still, her presence no longer directing the moment, but allowing it to deepen. Because this was no longer about hierarchy. It was about clarity. Ethan gave a small nod, not as approval, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. "Most people do," he said quietly, and there was no edge in his voice, no bitterness, just truth, the kind that does not need to be defended. A man near the glass wall shifted his weight, lowering his gaze slightly. Another employee turned off the recording on their phone, without realizing they had been holding it up the entire time. Small movements, quiet corrections, each one signaling that something inside the room had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to matter. Victoria stepped forward just a fraction, her voice calm, but carrying a new tone, one that no longer came from position, but from alignment. "What you offered today," she said, "was more than a number." 2 sentences followed, deliberate, sincere, and what we did with it revealed more about us than about you. The words did not accuse, they did not criticize, they simply reflected, like a mirror placed gently in front of a moment no one could now ignore. Ethan listened, then glanced briefly toward the entrance. The glass doors still open, sunlight spilling in quietly, as if the world outside had continued without interruption. And in that small detail, there was something grounding, something that reminded him that this moment, as heavy as it felt, was still just a moment. He adjusted his jacket slightly. A simple movement, unhurried. Then it served its purpose, he said, And the sentence was not dramatic, not emphasized, but it carried a finality that settled deeper than anything before it. The receptionist looked at him again, her expression no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, but thoughtful. "Will you come back?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could reshape it, not as a request for business, but as something quieter, more human. Ethan paused for a brief second, considering not the question itself, but what it represented. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "That depends," he said, his voice steady, "on what you do the next time someone walks in who looks like me." 3 seconds passed, a silence that did not need to be filled, because the answer was not meant to be spoken, it was meant to be lived, and in that silence, something settled fully into place, not just in the room, but in the people standing within it, a quiet understanding that respect is not proven in grand gestures. It is revealed in small, unseen moments, and those are the ones that stay. No one answered his question, not out loud, not immediately, because some questions are not meant to be answered with words. They are meant to settle into a place deeper than speech, and as the silence stretched, it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt necessary, like a pause that allowed something real to take root. The receptionist lowered her gaze again, not to avoid him, but to think, truly think. For the first time since he had walked through those doors, "I would treat them differently," she said finally, her voice quiet, but steady enough to carry. 3 words followed, simple, unpolished. "I would ask first," she added, and this time, there was no hesitation, no attempt to protect herself, just a clear recognition of what had been missing before. The room listened, not because they were waiting for approval, but because they understood that the moment had shifted from observation to accountability. Victoria watched her carefully, not with judgment, but with a kind of measured attention, the kind that weighs sincerity without interrupting it. And after a brief second, she gave a small nod, not as validation, but as acknowledgement that something had changed, something small, but real. Ethan stood still, his posture unchanged, but his eyes softened just slightly, not in emotion, not in relief, but in recognition, because growth, even in its smallest form, carries weight. "That is where it starts," he said quietly, and the sentence did not rise, it settled. Like everything else he had offered that day, steady, grounded, final. A man near the back shifted his stance again, this time not out of discomfort, but awareness. Another employee straightened their shoulders, no longer trying to disappear into the background, because the room itself had changed, not physically, not visibly, but in the way it held people accountable to what they now understood. Victoria glanced once more at Ethan, then toward the front desk, then back again, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that no longer needed to prove itself. "What happened here today," she said, "will not be written in a report." 2 sentences followed, deliberate, intentional. "It will not be filed or archived or reviewed later." She paused briefly, letting the words settle. "It will be remembered in how you act next time." The message did not land as a warning. It landed as a responsibility, and that made it heavier, not lighter. The receptionist nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting, not deflecting, just accepting. Ethan glanced once toward the glass doors. Again, the light outside still steady, unchanged, and in that simple detail, there was a quiet reminder that the world does not pause for moments like this, but people do. And sometimes, that is enough. He took a small step forward, not toward the counter, not toward anyone, but simply toward the exit, his movement calm, unhurried, as if the outcome of the moment had already been decided long before anyone realized it. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice softer now, not formal, not distant, but genuine, the kind of gratitude that does not come from obligation, but from understanding. Ethan paused briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the words, then gave a small nod, not turning fully, not needing to, because some acknowledgments do not require eye contact, only presence. And as he continued toward the door, the room did not follow him with whispers or reactions, it followed him with silence, the kind that lingers long after someone leaves, the kind that does not fade easily, because it carries something with it, something unseen, something that reshapes how people see the next person who walks through those same doors. And that was the real shift, not the check, not the title, but the understanding that stayed behind. The door did not make a sound when he stepped through it, just a soft shift of air, a quiet transition from one space into another, and yet the absence he left behind was unmistakable, not because he had demanded attention, but because he had changed the way attention worked in that room, and for several long seconds after he was gone, no one spoke, not out of obligation, not out of uncertainty, but because something inside them had not yet settled. The receptionist remained still behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on the surface, no longer gripping it, no longer using it as a shield, just resting, as if she needed a moment to understand what had just happened. "I almost laughed," she said finally, her voice low, almost to herself. 3 words followed, quiet, reflective, before I even listened. And the admission did not seek forgiveness. It did not ask for correction. It simply existed, honest and unguarded. Victoria stood nearby, her gaze still directed toward the door, not watching him leave, but considering what he had left behind, because she understood something most people in that room were only beginning to grasp. Moments like this do not end when a person walks away. They begin. She turned slightly, her posture relaxed but grounded. "Then do not forget that feeling," she said, her tone calm, but carrying weight. 2 sentences followed, deliberate, steady. "Not the embarrassment," she added, "but the awareness." The distinction mattered, and it landed. The receptionist nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting, not questioning, just accepting the responsibility that had quietly been placed in her hands. Across the room, the employees who had once watched for entertainment now stood in silence, no longer observers, but participants in something they could not unsee. A man who had raised his phone earlier slipped it into his pocket, his expression thoughtful. Another woman adjusted her posture, no longer leaning back with casual confidence, but standing upright, aware of the space she occupied and the people who might enter it next. Small changes, subtle, but real. Victoria stepped toward the counter, her heels softer now against the marble, not because they had changed, but because the room had. She placed her hand lightly on the surface, not to assert control, but to ground the moment. "What happened here today," she said, "will not be corrected by policy. One breath, one measured pause. It will be corrected by practice." The words settled, not as instruction, but as truth, and no one argued. Because there was nothing left to defend, the receptionist looked down briefly, then back up. Her eyes clearer now, more present. "I will remember," she said, and this time, it was not a promise to someone else. It was a commitment to herself. Victoria nodded once, then turned toward the glass doors, the light still steady, unchanged, the world outside continuing as it always does. And yet something inside that room would not continue the same way again. Because once a moment like this happens, it rewrites the quiet rules people live by, even if no one speaks about it again. And somewhere beyond those doors, Ethan walked on, not looking back, not needing to.